In this video, we're going to examine an unseen transcript of the Lucy Letby case, which reveals that yet another claim made by Dr. Dewi Evans is extremely poorly founded. But before we can do that, we need to get into some context regarding the claim itself and the infant to which it relates. The claim relates to a question posed by Dr. Shu Lee in the Channel 4 documentary on the Lucy Letby case. During this press conference, Dr. Lee posed several questions to Dr. Evans, the first of which was, if our panel found so many problems with the medical care provided by this team at the hospital, how is it that Dr. Evans found none? Because in none of the 17 cases did he even identify one problem with the medical care provided at the hospital. In response to this, Dr. Evans claimed, and I quote, "I made it very clear that there was the delay in giving antibiotics in the case of baby D." Now, this is the only criticism of the management of the babies, as Dr. Evans describes it, that he could point to. So in this video, we're going to assess the validity of this claim that he, quote, made it very clear that there was this delay in giving antibiotics. It's important to note that this needs to be explicitly critical of the hospital. This is Dr. Shu Lee challenging Dr. Evans on why he wasn't able to identify problems and why he wasn't able to be critical of the medical care provided at the Countess of Chester. So when Dr. Evans deals with the antibiotics in the case of baby D, in order to respond to this statement of Dr. Lee and claim that it was factually incorrect, as Dr. Evans did, he needs to say something specific about how this infant received poor care because the antibiotics were delayed. He isn't able to point to any other examples at all. This is the sole example that he's able to cite. Now, considering the scale of problems on the unit, it's already fairly extraordinary that Dr. Evans is only able to point to one issue. But then we know from leaked police documents that he never looked for anything else. He never made any effort to understand what was happening at the hospital. He hand-waved the opportunity to see previous reports, and he didn't want other experts to be involved. One has to question the motives behind these actions, but what we can say for certain is that, as an example, the 25 issues that are on the screen now, which is not an exhaustive account of all the problems at the Countess of Chester and all of the individual issues with the management of care of these infants, of those 25, Dr. Evans has picked out one very specific thing related to one infant as the only thing that he provided in court with regard to the mismanagement of the babies. That is the only thing he's able to point out, and the only thing he's able to cite. He's not able to point at anything else. And eventually we'll go through more cross-examination of Dr. Evans. I'm trying to get hold of every single cross-examination of Dr. Evans in the court case. We've already been through several of them. We've seen, for example, in the case of child C, that he downplays the very obvious signs of a bowel obstruction that wasn't spotted by the hospital. It wasn't managed correctly, and it very obviously led to the collapse and death of child C. We're going to have a look at child D in this video, but you'll see throughout all of his interviews, all of his cross-examination, everything that he said in court, that he repeatedly claims that the hospital responded in the correct fashion and didn't make any mistakes at all. That's why he's not able to point to anything other than this one issue over antibiotics. Now, it's important to emphasise at this point that the delay in antibiotics is considered critical by essentially every medical professional that's looked at this case other than Dr. Evans and Dr. Bohin. So this isn't some trivial issue. I should emphasise myself that medical professionals asked me to look at this case and highlighted to me that it's important for me to understand this case because this is a very clear example of mismanagement, and frankly, it looks like a clear-cut case of negligence. The parents would have a very good claim that their baby was mismanaged and that they should ultimately receive compensation. We saw the mother of child D appear in the recent Netflix documentary, and I know that a friend of mine who's a nurse, she thinks that the mother is starting to question the care that the infant received. Unfortunately, the mother is still in the mindset that she's been led into by the police, I should say the incompetent police in particular, and to a certain extent by the court process, which is that Lucy Letby is to blame. But in actual fact, this infant should never have died. If this infant had been dealt with competently on the unit, this infant would have survived. That's an important thing to emphasise before we go any further. So in the court reporting of the Lucy Letby case, we see a few references to antibiotics. There's this first one where the mother of child D is concerned about infection as the infant hasn't been given any antibiotics, which proved to be critical in the care of this child. There's another reference here in which the father recalls that they were told antibiotics were not necessary, And then we see Lucy herself talking about antibiotics and sepsis, and then she also has a conversation with someone with regard to meningitis. Obviously, there are signs of infection in this infant, and that these were clear on the unit, and they will become clearer as we continue. And this was indeed critical in the overall clinical picture of child D. We also then see Ben Myers cross-examining Caroline Oakley, and he's talking about this delay in administering antibiotics to the infant. And then this is the last and possibly most significant aspect of the court process for child D before Dr. Evans comes into the witness box, which we're going to go over shortly. There's discussion here with Ben Myers regarding antibiotics and how they should be administered and given in timely fashion to a neonatal infant. And then in this discussion here, Mr. Myers says the reality is that from the point of collapse at 12 minutes, so this infant was unresponsive at birth, floppy, obviously in a very perilous state. Given everything we know, the plan would have been to give antibiotics rapidly. Yes, I think so. Mr. Myers says child D was not given antibiotics until 4 hours after birth at the neonatal unit. Dr. Rylance agrees that this is the case. There was a 4-hour delay in the delivery of antibiotics after birth. You may not be responsible, but that falls below the standard of care for a newborn baby, doesn't it? Yes. The purpose of antibiotics is to treat and reduce the risk of infection. Yes. So this is very clearly establishing that the delay in antibiotics was significant in the development of infection in this infant, and is ultimately significantly responsible for the collapse and death of this infant. This infant that faced massive problems from just 12 minutes into the short and tragic life of child D. So in the original court reporting of the cross-examination of Dr. Evans on child D, we see absolutely no reference to antibiotics. So I really wanted to find out if he did mention antibiotics in court, and I've acquired the transcript for this cross-examination. It's obviously the case that court reporting typically goes over the key events in relation to what has occurred in court. That is, after all, the job of court reporters. So it seemed clear that if Dr. Evans had significantly mentioned antibiotics, that this would be in the court reporting. However, we now know exactly what he said in court, and I'm going to go over this in this video. I should emphasise that the panel of neonatal experts pointed to the failure to give antenatal antibiotics for prolonged premature rupture of membranes. So the rupture of membranes in this infant is all very significant. I'm not going to go into all these medical details in great depth because the video would last for a very long time, but it's important to understand that this was deemed to be significant, and this was understood at the time. Then we see the verdict that this infant should have been given intrapartum antibiotics, and that the child D died of systemic sepsis, pneumonia, and disseminated intravascular coagulation. But infection is very, very important in this infant, as is point 3, that there was a delay in recognising respiratory distress after birth and starting antibiotics. So the reason this infant dies is that the infant was suffering with respiratory problems from birth. That's very evident because the infant collapses. The infant is floppy, already in an extremely perilous state. After 12 minutes, this was absolutely evident. In court, very disingenuously, they pointed to APGAR scores as being significant, but they're only taken after a few minutes. You can't look at the APGAR scores and say, oh, well, they're really good. Oh, by the way, the infant collapsed after 12 minutes, was floppy, basically dying, and then had very extended respiratory distress for a very extended period of time, but that's not relevant because of the APGAR scores. We're going to go over that shortly. And then on top of that, there was very clear sign of infection that should have been treated. This was an avoidable death, as I've said previously. Unfortunately, the hospital completely failed. And what we'll see, as you can probably already imagine, in court is Dr. Evans downplaying all of these factors. The next thing I want to highlight is that there had already been a pathology report and verdict for this infant, and you can see here that congenital pneumonia has been cited, and this was part of the ultimate verdict of the pathologist that examined the infant. I should briefly mention at this point as well that there's a non-indictment infant in the case that was also suffering with congenital pneumonia, and Dr. Evans ruled this infant out of the case. We can only imagine why that is. Probably more than likely it's because Lucy Letby couldn't be linked with this infant. But there's no objective reason to overturn this in this case. It's essentially utterly ridiculous. It's wrong in any situation to overturn pathology reports without very good reason, but given the extremely poor work from Dr. Evans, that becomes amplified in this situation. But in any case where any medical professional examines an infant, examines the case notes, looks at the clinical picture for child D, they will conclude that the original pathology verdict is far more likely to be correct than what we hear from Dr. Evans. In fact, I think for this infant we can go beyond that and say that what Dr. Evans says in relation to child D is farcical. It just has absolutely no basis in medical evidence or anything that would look like a competent medical process. We've seen previously in the court case he was accused in this other court case. This was mentioned in court. It was raised in court. It was passed to Judge James Goss that in this previous court case, Lord Justice Jackson had accused him of working out an opinion to exculpate the person that he was effectively defending, described by Lord Justice Jackson as Dr. Evans' report has the hallmarks of an exercise in working out an explanation that exculpates the applicants. So this is the reverse situation. This is the hallmarks of an exercise in working out an explanation that convicts the defendant. There's no better example of that than in the case of Child D. We can actually now also see that very clearly in the leaked documents from Cheshire Police. We can see Dr. Evans just trying to work out an explanation as it's perfectly described by Lord Justice Jackson, trying to work out an explanation that can get the case to court so they can go to court. So effectively, in the end, he essentially destroys Lucy Letby's life. And if he'd actually competently, rationally, objectively assessed the clinical picture of Child D, he would have come to the same conclusion as every other medical expert that examines the infant, and indeed the pathologist that examined the infant directly. What he did in this case is simply without any legitimate or rational explanation. So when I had a highly experienced neonatal practitioner examine the background to Child D, she described the infant as struggling to breathe from birth. That's very evident because of the 12-minute collapse that we've discussed already, but we're going to go into this in more detail as well. When Dr. Sandy Bohin spoke on this infant in court, she described the babies as being this baby as being born in good condition. So elsewhere in media comments, both Evans and Bohin have denied the fact that they misrepresented the condition of infants in the case. So I'll leave viewers to judge whether they've misrepresented the condition of this infant. So you can see here what's described as the SAT, essentially the saturation rate, which gives indication of the quality of breathing of the infant, essentially was at 47% on the arrival at the neonatal unit, and this continued for an extended period of time. So a sustained oxygen saturation of 47% in neonates represents severe hypoxemia, and depending on how long it persists and how the baby responded, substantially raises the risk of immediate collapse in the brain and other organ injury. And we know that in this infant it can continue and did continue for an indeterminate period of time, because the record of the recovery from 47% is not evident in medical notes that have been released or in the court case. To give you an indication of this, it should be possible for an infant, when an infant is born with respiratory problems, within a matter of minutes this figure should have risen to 85%, and then within 10 minutes to 90%. Instead, this infant has collapsed after 12 minutes. The fact that this remained prolonged at 47% for a significant period of time is very obviously indicative of respiratory distress, as the panel has indeed noted. That's why the panel have said that the infant was suffering with respiratory distress, and that's why any medical professional that examines the case will very easily recognise this. So as mentioned here, low oxygen levels and reduced oxygen delivery to organs, if prolonged, will result in bradycardia, hypertension, metabolic acidosis, and if not rapidly corrected, cardiac respiratory arrest, which is essentially the exact clinical picture that we see for this infant. This would be a very easy diagnosis for any paediatrician or neonatologist, or for that matter, a generalist doctor, I would say. I just want to mention as well, again, that the mother had this prolonged rupture of membranes, which increased the risk of intrapartum infection and infection of the mother's amniotic fluid. This is an infection, I should say, of the mother's amniotic fluid. We see a very clear picture of infection in this infant. There's multiple signs of this, plus they didn't do the one thing that was required to treat this infection, which is give the antibiotics that we're going to go on to discuss, and that has proved to be critical in the tragic outcome of this infant. So let's remind you that Dr. Evans, quote, made it very clear that there was the delay in giving antibiotics in the case of baby D, according to his own account. So we're now going to assess the validity of this assertion. So we know in court reporting that there's no reference to Dr. Evans mentioning antibiotics, and when you look at the court proceedings for Child D, it soon becomes extremely evident why there is no reference to this in the court reporting. So we have Dr. Evans here being questioned by Nick Johnson. And he says, did you consider the issue of the failure to give Mother D any antibiotics in the light of her premature membrane rupture? And Dr. Evans says, I did, I'm not sure, yes, I did, yes. So it's his usual stuttering commentary that we've become used to. Another highly convincing response there from Dr. Evans. So we're obviously going to look at what he actually said in court in relation to this. But he wrote 8 reports on child D while he was engaged in his exercise in working out how to convict Lucy Letby, as described by Lord Justice Jackson. So, obviously, with regard to a previous case. So, in these 8 reports, he might claim that he considered this issue. I should say he's not being cross-examined here. He's essentially being interviewed by his own barrister, and the prosecuting barrister is trying to lead him into making certain statements, and yet he still gives his usual stuttering response. That would indicate to me that it's quite possible, particularly as he says, I'm not sure, that he didn't actually ever consider this failure, because he knew if he was to consider this, he would have to cite this as being significant, as indeed any qualified medical professional would. So it's perfectly possible that he never mentioned this in any of the reports, and he never considered it, and he deliberately swept it under the carpet. We don't know that for sure, because we don't have his reports, but there's quite strong evidence pointing to that as we continue to go through this court process. But what I want to remind people is that Dr. Evans stated that he made it very clear. I made it very clear that there was the delay in giving antibiotics in the case of baby D. So he never even volunteered the information. But as we go on, we'll see how clear he made it. And I also want to remind people he's supposed to cite this as being a significant aspect of poor care on the unit. If he doesn't do that, there's no point in mentioning it. He certainly doesn't spontaneously mention it himself. So this was supposed to be a response saying, oh, I did cite poor care on the unit. So he needs to mention this, and he needs to discuss this in the context of there being poor care on the unit. Later on, we see this is the second reference that Dr. Evans makes to antibiotics, where he just says she received antibiotics and she received respiratory support and intravenous fluids, essentially just saying this is a good thing, she received good care and good support from the unit. We then see him go on to downplay the pneumonia. The pneumonia was not responsible in any way for baby D's death. Pneumonia is probably the condition that clinicians like myself have dealt with more commonly than any other condition any other condition really. And in a situation like this, pneumonia with the correct treatment is curable. You just treat it, antibiotics, oxygen, breathing support if necessary. So standard pneumonia treatment, that's what we do. That's why she was in the neonatal unit. Now, I'm not sure if all that's true. It's probably not true. It sounds like the typical kind of cock and bull story that Dr. Evans makes up, but let's not examine that too much. The point is that he's saying here, we just treat this with antibiotics, and they did treat it with antibiotics, so they did the right thing completely, downplaying the fact that antibiotics were delayed, which he's supposed to have made very clear according to his own words. Obviously, he's also downplayed the pneumonia as well. And then there's this section where we know the Mother D, hadn't been given antibiotics, contrary in fact to the guidelines of the hospital. You're seeing that now. That's right, isn't it? Yes, that is correct. I heard the evidence, yes. And also in baby D's case, antibiotics weren't given until 4 hours after birth. That is correct. And that is a delay that falls below the acceptable standard in a circumstances, doesn't it? It does. So this is Ben Myers cross-examining Dr. Evans, and this is the first time he really acknowledges this. It's not something that he volunteered. No, it's not him saying, I cited this in my report and this is unacceptable. He's just confirming something that the cross-examining barrister said, because he can't say that it's not true, because it's very obviously true. As I said previously, it's far from guaranteed that this was ever in his reports, but he certainly didn't make it very clear, as he stated, and he certainly didn't emphasise this delay and this error on the unit. He did concede it under cross-examination, but to imply that he strongly made this criticism is rubbish. And then in addition to that, I'm not going to go over everything in this section, but I'm sure you can imagine what happened in the remaining cross-examination of Dr. Evans in relation to child D. He tried to emphasise the child was fine, the child was doing well, the pneumonia was okay, this antibiotics issue wasn't really an issue, everyone on the unit was fantastic, and then the infant just collapsed for no reason. What he does on every single case. So his claim that, oh yeah, I highlighted the antibiotics, the only thing he could say about the care on the unit, he could only highlight one thing, and the one thing that he highlighted, he never really even said in the first place. So bear in mind as well, he went through the entire discussion with his own barrister, effectively his own barrister, Nick Johnson, the prosecuting barrister. At no point did he volunteer the information that the antibiotics had been given too late. He certainly didn't mention it as being significant. We had this stuttering response that he gave, which would even question whether he mentioned it in his own reports. He certainly didn't emphasise it as being significant. The only time where he says it falls below the acceptable standard is when cross-examined here by Ben Myers, and then he does everything possible in the remainder of his cross-examination to diminish and downplay this. Ben Myers essentially has to drag it out of him. So the idea that he made this very clear and that he mentioned it as a specific criticism of the hospital is just plainly untrue. And then there's this phrase that sums up how untrue the claim that he made in the Channel 4 documentary is, because he says here, once she got there, she was about 4 hours of age when she got there, and I thought her management was entirely consistent with what I'd expect of a modern neonatal unit. So he's absolutely downplaying any mistakes on the unit and saying that they dealt with her in the fashion you would expect, that it was a good quality of care, essentially. So on the one hand, he says her management was entirely consistent with what I'd expect, and on the other hand, he accepts that they didn't give antibiotics for 4 hours. And essentially, every other medical professional that looks at this says, well, that was an absolutely critical factor in the collapse of this infant. It's just Dr. Evans and Dr. Bohin that don't say this. I now want to compare these three statements together. First of all, we have the question from Dr. Shu Lee of why in none of the 17 cases did Dr. Evans even identify one problem with the medical care provided at the hospital. Then we have the claim from Dr. Evans that he made it very clear that there was a delay in giving antibiotics in the case of baby D. And then we see that Dr. Evans firstly indicates his belief that the management of the infant was entirely consistent with what he'd expect from a modern neonatal unit, and he even emphasises that the infant received antibiotics and respiratory support, intravenous fluids, implying that her care on the unit was ideal. So we already know that this claim from Dr. Evans, that he specifically cited the delay in giving antibiotics, he says he made it very clear. It was in fact dragged out of him in cross-examination, and based on what we can see in this transcript, it's likely that he never even included this in any of his multiple reports, based on what was said in court. We don't know because we don't have his reports, but based on what I've seen, I would be surprised if he cited it, and we can say with some certainty that he definitely didn't cite it as being significant. So I want to go over the clinical picture of this infant, and then we're going to contrast that with what Dr. Evans says in court. So this child was delivered by an emergency caesarean section for failed induction of labour after prolonged premature ruptured membranes, as we've already established. That's the first significant thing. At 12 minutes, she became pale and floppy and needed respiratory support with bag and mask. She had admitted to the neonatal unit. So again, I'm not sure why they're reading out those scores in court. I mean, that's just essentially the prosecuting barrister and Dr. Evans trying to mislead the court. 3.5 hours later, she was cold, blue, dusky, and had respiratory distress, polycythemia, and infection. The first blood casts taken 4 hours after birth showed high CO2 and respiratory acidosis. Continuous positive airway pressure was started nearly 4 hours after birth. She was electively intubated after 3 attempts and ventilated her chest x-ray, which showed pneumonia. The following day she developed fever, deteriorating blood gases and increasing metabolic acidosis. The next day she was mottled and had dark brown and black tracking lesions across the trunk and 2 evolving purpuric looking patches on the abdomen. She had prolonged coagulation times, raised CRP, and repeated episodes of apnea and desaturation until final collapse and death. So this was an infant who suffered with a lot of issues on the unit, albeit it should have been possible to save this infant if the treatment had not even been optimal, just competent, I would say. So we're now going to contrast that with what Dr. Evans says about this infant in court. So the first thing is that Dr. Evans says the infant was getting better. She was making what I consider to be a very satisfactory improvement, and in fact a far more rapid improvement than I would expect given the condition she was in when she arrived at the unit. but all the respiratory markers monitoring that were carried out were great, and therefore she was taken off endotracheal intubation, yes. So that's just a taster of what we're going to hear in this commentary. Now, I'm mainly just going to go through this with minimal analysis, but I will go into some more details later. But I just want you to compare how Dr. Evans describes this infant and the condition of this infant with the discussion from the expert panel. So he says here, completely and therefore standard management, she still needs a little bit of support. CPAP is that form of support. So she was put on CPAP and she stabilised very, very promptly on what is by any standards very minimal respiratory support. So that was great. And over the day, as we've heard, her condition stabilised and, she remained very well. So this infant is very well. She was stable on CPAP and the medical staff in the evening prior to her collapse took her off CPAP. This didn't work, so they put her back on CPAP. That is perfectly standard management, especially in a baby who by this time was not needing additional oxygen. She was a big baby, over 3 kilograms. Some babies don't like CPAP very much, It's quite intrusive, can be having something over your face. So they tried her off CPAP. Her oxygen saturations dropped, so they put her back on CPAP, and her condition reverted to normal, more or less, straight away, and stayed perfectly normal in air oxygen saturations normal until the early hours of the following morning. So everything is just normal. Everything's great. So her condition could not have been better. It couldn't possibly have been in a better condition. And her condition clinically was entirely consistent with a baby recovering from early onset pneumonia. Not recovered from pneumonia, recovering from pneumonia. Nobody, I think, recovers from pneumonia in such a short time. So this, she was really doing exceptionally well and clinically very satisfactory. So in my book, I've written the following. Commenting on this in court, Dr. Evans accepted that pneumonia was present, but claimed that the pneumonia was not responsible in any way for her death. When I put this to Professor Colin Morley, he told me plainly, Evans simply has no basis for saying this. So what he essentially does, as we'll see as this video continues, is that he just rules out anything as being irrelevant that's inconvenient to what he sees as his role of acting in favour of the prosecution. So then he goes, extremely satisfactory. Her improvement was far quicker than I would have expected, to be frank. It was remarkable that her oxygen values, oxygen saturations, 100% or 99%, without the need for any supplemental oxygen at all. That is an indicator of a baby whose lungs are functioning satisfactorily. It's inconsistent so he's going on now to talk about the pneumonia again. It's inconsistent with the pneumonia or any other one of the inconsistent with what we call septicemia or sepsis, in other words, a generalised infection. If she had a generalised infection, sepsis, she would not have made this very prompt recovery within a very short period of time. And then he goes on, no, the pneumonia was not responsible in any way for baby D's death. Pneumonia is probably the condition that clinicians like myself have dealt with more commonly than any other condition. So I've read this out before, but there's a reason that I'm going through this again. Any other condition, really. And in a situation like this, pneumonia with the correct treatment is curable. You just treat it, antibiotics, oxygen, breathing support if necessary. So standard pneumonia treatment, that's what we do. That's why she was in the neonatal unit. So this is the kind of typical thing that he does, where if there are any issues, he just says, was the baby chronically ill? And he'll say, that's why she was on a neonatal unit. It's just the kind of specious crap that he comes up with on a regular basis. So this continues. Did you reach a conclusion as to what caused or what was consistent with being the cause of baby D's deaths? Yes, I did. So notice this comment, consistent with. So we'll talk about that in a second. Yes, I did. As we know, as with when I've given evidence before, initially all I had to go on were the clinical records, and I formed the view this is an extraordinarily unusual collapse, unexpected collapse. This is something that is consistent with her having sustained intravenous air. In other words, she'd received an injection of air, of gas, through a vein into her circulation, causing what we call an air embolus. So the key thing here is saying consistent with. So to say that the most likely or most credible diagnosis, Dr. Evans liked to describe his kind of batshit hypotheses as diagnoses, to say that the most likely diagnosis of this infant is the injection of air is absolutely without foundation. It's utterly ridiculous. It's perhaps something that cannot be entirely ruled out, and that's why they're using this term consistent with. But if you look at the clinical picture of this infant, to say that this infant collapsed due to the injection of air for which there is no real evidence, when there is an absolute ton of evidence pointing to infection, pointing to medical errors on the unit, and we're going to ignore all of that and ignore the respiratory problems and the very obvious respiratory collapse of this infant, and we're going to say, oh, it's consistent with the injection of air, so we'll just say that it's the injection of air, is utterly ridiculous. Any medical professional who's watching this video who's encountered this will know that it's just absolute crap. So then he doubles down and says, as I've discussed earlier, air embolus is incredibly rare, but this is I concluded was the only explanation, that the only cause that could explain baby D's collapse and death. So yeah, it's the only possible explanation. There's no other conceivable explanation for the collapse and death of this infant. And by this stage as well, in the very early stages of this court case, particularly with regard to infants A, B and C, there was this big effort made to emphasise the shift chart and then emphasise that Lucy Letby is on duty. And then a lot of inference was made by that. And already by baby D, they're starting to make this inference, and they require less and less evidence for anything they're saying. They just say, oh, look, Lucy was there again. We've already established that it's always Lucy. So I'm now going to walk you through the points that Dr. Evans cited in order to make his so-called diagnosis. So I'm not going to respond to these immediately. I will go through them after I've been through the whole thing. So he says, the first is that her collapse, this was a collapse of a baby who was stable and who had an intravenous line in place, and where the collapse was unexpected and the changes were rapid and very, very striking. In other words, the drop in oxygen saturation being the main one. So that was my first stage in reaching this diagnosis of air embolus. The second stage was the presence of this discoloration, which is unique in two ways. I will just say at this point it's definitely not unique. The first is that it was a pattern of discoloration that experienced neonatal nurses had never seen before, and experienced medical people, one of whom is now a neonatologist in Glasgow, had never seen before and had never seen since. So we've got this extraordinarily unusual pattern of discoloration. I thought it was unique. The second aspect of the discoloration was that it came and it went. It came and it went. Again, this is something that you do not find as a result of sepsis or other disorders. So that was my second step. So, of course, this can just be related to observation issues. You've just said that they've never seen anything like this before, so that observations could be wrong, that observations could be misguided, etc., etc. My third stage in reading this diagnosis was that resuscitation was unsuccessful. This is the fourth of our 17 cases, and I think we'll find in future cases that babies did deteriorate as a result of the usual complications that one gets in babies. Infection mainly, and resuscitation carried out by experienced medical staff works. You don't need, they just get better. So therefore the third step in getting to my diagnosis was the fact that she failed to respond to pretty thorough efforts of resuscitation. So all I would say to that is, it's pretty obvious that all he has really done here is, I will just assume that they've made an effort on the unit and it's failed, so therefore there's no explanation for this collapse, so therefore it's a sudden unexplained collapse. Because he never looked at it, he never looked at the hospital, he never made any criticisms. This is the whole basis of what Shu Lee was saying. He hand-waved the idea that he should even look at the hospital because he didn't want to do that, because he wanted to come to the conclusion that there was malfeasance here. That was always intended to be the case. My fourth stage, which again I defer to the radiology and pathology opinion on, is the presentation of air in the great vessels. The local report said air in the aorta, so the great vessels could be the aorta or the vena cava. So again, we've got air in a great vessel, which is an incredibly unusual phenomenon, as our radiology colleagues will tell us. So they didn't say that in court at all. So that was stage 4. The fifth stage is that none of the other issues that affected child D were relevant. You can't explain this on the presence of a pneumonia affecting one lung. So we'll come back to that in a second. So in my opinion, in baby D's case, we had a full house of clinical characteristics entirely consistent with her having sustained an air embolus, i.e. air injected into her circulation. So we've got these 5 things. A collapse of a baby that was stable, the presence of discoloration, resuscitation was unsuccessful, presence of air described as an incredibly unusual phenomenon, and other issues weren't relevant. So let's just briefly go through these before I go over some other points. So firstly, to describe this baby as stable and to suggest that this is the collapse of a baby that was stable is just an utterly farcical suggestion. Talking about the presence of discoloration, we've been over this many, many times. It's just completely unfounded what Dr. Evans is saying in relation to this. He's just plainly wrong. We've been over so many times the problem with the diagnosis, the problem with the diagnostic sources, the fact that the author of the diagnostic source has said that Dr. Evans is incorrect, etc., etc. The third thing, as I've mentioned, he claims that resuscitation being unsuccessful is some sort of meaningful indicator of an air embolism. It's not. Resuscitation can be unsuccessful for many reasons, not least the fact that people on the unit are not up to the level of competence required, which he refused to examine. And indeed, of course, this is the subject of this whole video, is this claim that I made comments about the antibiotics, which of course he didn't, but even that was his only criticism of the unit or people working on the unit. With regard to the presence of air, he describes this as an incredibly unusual phenomenon, but actually the radiologist that he cited produced this study related to Great Ormond Street Hospital in which it was demonstrated that it's not an incredibly unusual phenomenon. And then with regard to other issues being not relevant, as I've discussed previously, he just decides, right, I'll just decide that the pneumonia isn't relevant, even though any other medic that looks at this infant, as I say, with the exception of Dr. Bohin, who surprisingly came to exactly the same conclusion as Dr. Evans, any other medic, particularly qualified paediatrician or neonatologist, or indeed the pathologist that examined the infant, will conclude that it was very relevant. Just as Dr. Evans decided that the delay in antibiotics isn't relevant, or he didn't need to bring it up, or he didn't need to reference it, and he probably hasn't put it in his reports. He had to concede it when in the witness box, but he never focused on this as being significant because he came up with this absolutely farcical so-called diagnosis. So there's some further points that I want to go through. As I mentioned, there's no basis to discount pneumonia and infection. The only reason to do this is if you want to blame Lucy Letby. Any rational and objective diagnosis as infant could not possibly draw this conclusion. The second thing is that Lucy was called in to assist with this infant by another nurse, was not present for the initial collapses, and raised the alarm when the infant collapsed for a third time. There is no even allegation of the mechanism via which Lucy Letby supposedly harmed this infant. It's entirely based on the "it's always Lucy" theory. It relies entirely on inference and the discredited shift chart. There are all kinds of logistical problems in many of these cases, with Lucy having supposedly done the things that Dr. Evans suggests that she did. There's no effort made by the prosecution to reconcile this. They just say, oh look, there's definitely been a crime here, there's definitely been some attack on infants, oh look at the shift chart, it's always Lucy. Fourthly, there's nothing about the clinical presentation of this infant that points to air being significant, and of course there's a hell of a lot of things that point to the opposite. Dr. Evans has downplayed all of these factors or ignored much more obvious indicators, as any nurse or doctor will testify, other than Dr. Sandy Bohin, of course. And then fifthly, the last and very obvious point to make is that Dr. Evans completely misrepresented the respiratory picture of this infant. This demonstrates either utter ineptitude or a determination to blame Lucy Letby for everything. So I'm finally going to return to a little bit of the cross-examination of Dr. Evans. I'm not going to go through the entirety of the cross-examination for Child D because he talks on for an inordinate amount of time spouting crap about this infant. One day I might go through the whole thing. But I just wanted to go over this bit. So there's this comment stating that if Child D is recovering, that means she still has the potential to become quite unwell, doesn't it? So instead of saying yes, which is the honest answer, he says she's in a neonatal unit, the best place for her on the planet. And that's what he always relies on. He will just always say, if this infant is unwell, or if this infant has clear signs of being unwell, he'll just fall back on his default position of, well, she's in a neonatal unit, so it's all fine. If she was becoming unwell as a result of infection, she was on full monitoring, she had nurses all around her, she had doctors around the corner, as it were, and we recognise doctors and nurses on neonatal units, we recognise clinical characteristics that would indicate she's not as well, or she's just getting worse. She showed none of those just prior to 1:30 in the morning. So let's just break that down. So he's not saying this is specifically the case. He's saying people on the unit would have hypothetically recognised these things. So we can rule, if they didn't recognise them, we can just rule out the fact that they exist, which is not what you're being asked to do. You're not being asked to look at of course he didn't as well. That's another thing to add to this. He didn't look at what happened in the hospital. He hand-waved the idea that he needed to look at the hospital. He just looked at the clinical notes and worked things around that. He refused to look at the reports. He refused to look at the contextual picture of the hospital. He refused to make any criticisms of the hospital. So here, he's just hypothetically assuming, oh, well, someone would have noticed something, so we can just rule that out. When in actual fact, he could have examined all of these things himself. But that's his job is not to just say, right, well, we'll just assume that all the nurses and doctors were right, because obviously they will be right. His job is to actually look at the clinical picture of the infant and make a diagnosis on that basis, not say, well, if there was pneumonia or if there was infection or if there's respiratory distress, people on the unit would have noticed it, and they didn't, so therefore none of those things exist. Again, this is just absolute batshit nonsense. And then there's this exchange. So Evans begins by saying she was breathing on her own. CPAP does not assist you, does not fill your lungs up and down or in and out, as it were. It is a measure simply to assist keeping the breathing tubes open between breaths. So therefore she was actually breathing of her own accord, but she needed this CPAP method as well. That is it. And then Ben Meyer says, a child in good health will not need to be ventilated. Do you agree? And Dr. Evans says she was recovering from pneumonia. So basically, here, when Dr. Evans needs the infection to be significant in order to maintain his position, he will say, oh yeah, in this situation, in this scenario, I've decided the pneumonia is significant. But then later on, when he doesn't need the pneumonia to be significant, he'll just say, oh yeah, it's now irrelevant now. I've decided it's irrelevant at this point. So let's go back to the three statements again. We have Dr. Lee challenging Dr. Evans on the fact that he didn't identify a single problem with the medical care provided at the hospital. We have Dr. Evans claiming that he made it very clear that there was a delay in giving antibiotics in the case of baby D, the only instance where he's made a single criticism of the management of the baby. He's only able to cite that one criticism because we see all the way through the rest of the court case, he heaps praise on the management of the babies over and over again. And then we see in the actual comments of Dr. Evans made during his cross-examination and made during the discussion of child D that he didn't cite the antibiotics at all. It's doubtful that it's even in his reports, and he never volunteered this information at all, firstly, and when he was forced to concede it, it was mostly in relation to cross-examination by Ben Myers. He gave a very stuttering response to his own barrister, Nick Johnson, and I'm saying his own barrister because he basically acted for the prosecution in this case, even though he claims otherwise. And in fact, he even cited the receipt of antibiotics as being a positive in the care given by the Council of Chester at this time. So the idea that, as he claims, he made it very clear there was a delay in antibiotics and that this was a significant criticism of the management of the babies is untenable. What we can see from his comments is that it's distinctly possible that he never even included this in his reports, and by his initial response to Nick Johnson, it seems that if he did include it in his reports, which is doubtful, he will not have included it in a critical way because we know what he said in court. He completely downplayed the significance of this, and he wouldn't even have brought it up were it not for the fact that he was cross-examined on it and he had to concede it. And then also Nick Johnson tried to preempt this by essentially prompting Dr. Evans to say that he'd considered it. Otherwise, he never would have mentioned it in the prosecution section at all. And when he did respond to this question, he responded it in such a way which suggests quite strongly that he never even wrote it in his report, let alone did he write in his report as a criticism of the hospital. And that's the only criticism to this day that he's been able to cite. So in summary, Dr. Dewi Evans has been extensively criticised for his role in the conviction of Lucy Letby. One of the central criticisms of Dr. Evans has been his portrayal of the treatment of infants at the Council of Chester Hospital as being optimal. This strongly contrasts with the opinion of much more qualified experts who have examined the processes and clinical notes from this time. These experts have cited a litany of problems on the unit. Many of these are evident now and have become common knowledge. Dr. Xu Li, commenting at a press conference, wondered why Dr. Evans had managed to find no criticisms or problems at the Cancer Chester Hospital during his assessment of the medical cases. In response to this, Dr. Evans was only able to cite one criticism, and this was that child D had received antibiotics far later than the infant should have. This is critically important, as all medical professionals who have examined this case believe that this was instrumental in the collapse and passing of the child. However, when we examine the court proceedings related to child D, we see that Dr. Evans didn't raise this at all. He was forced to concede this, but he in fact completely downplayed the significance of antibiotics, never specifically raising this point himself and indicating that the unit had operated in the manner of any competent neonatal unit. Far from criticising the failure to give antibiotics, he specifically mentioned the provision of antibiotics as being an example of good care on the unit. The claim from Dr. Evans that he referenced the failure to give antibiotics in court is, to be extremely generous, completely disingenuous. I would say that it's just simply plainly untrue. This remains the only explicit criticism of the unit that Dr. Evans has been able to cite. Not only that, but even this citation is not legitimate, as Dr. Evans never meaningfully referenced the antibiotics in the case of child D. Elsewhere, his so-called diagnosis for child D can only be described as laughable and would be dismissed by anyone with any medical qualifications, let alone any specialised paediatrician or neonatologist. So I hope you found this a useful investigation of this claim that Dr. Evans made, that he had referenced the delay in antibiotics. I obviously had seen the court reporting previously and thought it was very unlikely that this claim was legitimate, but now that we've examined it and now I've been fortunate enough to get hold of the court transcript for this infant, we can say that it's just plainly untrue. I just want to mention finally that you can pre-order my book on the Lucy Letby case through Cinto Press. I'll leave a link in the comment section of this video. I've interviewed over 65 experts for this book and it will be released on the 9th of July. So I hope that you can support this and buy and review the book online. I will update and discuss this further in the future, but I just wanted to make a quick reference to it here. Also, I've been trying to, and this isn't terribly important to me, I must emphasize this, but if you wanted to follow me on Twitter, I know it's called X now. I'm not the biggest fan of this platform. It's been very useful in Lucy's case, but if you could follow me, if you follow me on YouTube, you might want to follow me on Twitter/X. My handle is cpmorris1234, which I realise is a rubbish handle, but there you go, that's the one I picked. And I'm starting to post a little bit more on Twitter, and I will post more in the future. So I know not everyone likes that platform, but if you do have a Twitter account, if you do want to follow me, it will probably be helpful for me in the future in some respects, even though I basically don't really like Twitter that much. And then finally, I just want to mention that the analytics of the channel have been incredible recently. We've gone well over 6,000 subscribers now. As you can see on the left of the screen here, I've gone past 1 million views to the channel, which I never would have thought was possible. I didn't think it'd be possible at all, let alone in this time frame. So to have over 6,000 people subscribing, to have over 1 million views, and to be approaching 300,000 watch hours for the channel is incredible. And I'm enormously grateful for the support. But I'm just, all I can do is do my best to help Lucy to keep producing content. I'm going to try and make my book as big as I possibly can, and hopefully, raise more public awareness of this issue. And I'll just keep trying and trying. And it's very important to me that we resolve this. I think as well, Dr. Evans really needs to get his comeuppance. There's other people that need to get their comeuppance, but he is just a lamentable character. That's the nicest thing I can possibly say about him. It's just awful what he's been allowed to do in this case, and it speaks very unfavourably, shall we say, about our court system, about the way we select expert witnesses. With that being said, thank you very much for the support. Thank you for watching, and I'll look forward to reading your comments.